I'd like to welcome you here. As people were discussing before the official start time, these demos are being done a bit differently from the way we normally do them. And that has some benefits and some drawbacks. And so I will try and focus on the benefits at this point. I'm Edward Dunne. I'm the executive editor at Mathematical Reviews. Mathematical Reviews is the division of the AMS that produces MathSciNet. Mathematical Reviews has been going since 1940, and it's been going as MathSciNet since 1996, which means, of course, this is the 25th anniversary of MathSciNet this month. So it has a long history. Some of the things of the history are really good. It means that we have information about the math literature that goes back a very long time. And with the MathSciNet interface to the database, it became incredibly powerful as to what you can do. Sitting on the sidelines is Mike Jones. He's the managing editor at Mathematical Reviews. He's actually been at Math Reviews longer than I have. And he's going to be fielding questions and comments in chat. He and I have also agreed he's going to put a couple of links in there that will be helpful as we go along. And this is one of the benefits of doing this virtually instead of in person, is that if Mike puts a link or some other information in there, it's simple enough for you to click on that and go where you need to go. One or two of the links will be things that will allow you to download PDF files with some helpful information about how to use MathSciNet and things like that. You know, are a little bit harder to do in person. We can give you paper handouts, but then you leave JMM looking like the scarecrow from the Wizard of Oz with all sorts of stuff flying out around you. The theme of today's presentation is MathSciNet for mid-career mathematicians. If you're not a mid-career mathematician, that's fine. Either you were or you will be at some point. Also, many of the things that I'm going to talk about will be useful to any sort of person that wants to use MathSciNet. The first thing I want to do is show you how you can take MathSciNet on the road with you. That is what we call remote access or mobile pairing. And unfortunately, we begin by showing why it's so great to work for Mathematical Reviews. If you look at my screen, up in the top right corner, it says remote access, and there's this number 156. This is the way that we can get into a process for pairing your device, actually your browser, with a subscription to MathSciNet, so that rather than, say, being on campus or connected to the campus network through a VPN or an SSH or certain types of proxy servers that verify that you have access to a subscription, if you go through this process, you can take that access with you for up to 90 days. When you click on this, it puts you into a system that verifies that you have a pairing and then puts a cookie into your browser. And so it'll ask you some questions. The 156 up here demonstrates why it's good to work for Math Reviews. If you do this as an employee of Math Reviews, you get 180 days rather than 90 days. So if you're dying for 180 days instead of 90, give me a call and we can talk about hiring you. Right now, a lot of people have difficulty accessing their campuses. And if you can access things through a VPN, or an SSH tunnel, you can do this. If that's not available to you, the AMS set up a clever virtual way of doing remote pairing. And we sent instructions to the various subscription contacts, which typically would be the math librarian at your college or university. And that's a way where you can set up the mobile pairing by using a token that the librarian would give, a digital token that the librarian would send you in an email. You click through and you get your 90 days. You can actually repeat it. And I can't show that to you, unfortunately, because each one is set up differently for each different library. So find out who the math librarian is, where it may be the database librarian, the electronic products librarian at your library, and they can help you set up remote access through this alternative setup that we have for the pandemic lockdown procedures. All right. Second thing that I always like to describe to people is that MathSciNet is a window, or it's an interface into the Math Reviews database. And in some sense, there are actually 3 windows that are provided. Here, it automatically opens up with the search that people most frequently do. That's a publication search. A lot of times you think of this as, I want to find a paper or a book. And that's what we do here. It's a fielded search. You can look for authors, you can look for titles, you can search inside the review text. Various things are in here. The other sort of search is the author search. At other times, and this will be something I'll get into in a little bit more detail here, you actually want to find out something about a person. Typically, this person's role as an author of mathematical papers and books. And this search is actually different in that with the publications database, you're looking at all the information we have about many different things. With the author search, we can give you a little bit more help because you're only looking at the author database that we have. So if you start typing somebody's name, such as Gromov, the differential geometer, we can start suggesting things to you. And there is some sort of ranking going on in the background. How many letters that you've typed in correspond to letters in the name that's being used. How present is this person in the database, so that it will flesh things out. If you click on that, you come to a page that describes what we have in terms of data on the author. We try to put the key things up top. The pictures are provided by the author. You can go in, you can click on Edit Author Profile, and you can add a picture, you can add a URL for a website, you can add an email address. Down here, there are some things where it'll initiate a search. You can find the publications. You can find related publications. People don't always know what those are. This is something that the person is involved with but didn't necessarily write. So it could be something about him. So the first one here, it's the Abel Prize. Gromov won an Abel Prize. Other things down here, it would be an interview with him, where if he edited something, that would be a related publication. You can click and find all the reviews that he's written that we've published in MathSciNet. Something that's very handy is the refined search. If you want to look for something very specific about an author, in this case, Gromov, you click on refined search, and we guarantee that you've got exactly the right Gromov. There aren't that many Gromovs, but in this case, it pre-populates it with specifically this Mikhail Gromov. I introduced you to Mike Jones. He has a moderately common name in mathematics. You would want to make sure that you had this Michael Jones rather than another Michael Jones, and then start putting in other sorts of information, right? If you wanted to find out, what papers Gromov has written in Inventiones, because somebody told you that Gromov's Inventiones paper solves your problem. This makes sure that you don't have to wade through a lot of Gromov Inventiones, or in the case of Mike Jones, a lot of different Mike Joneses with papers in a particular journal or in a particular area. You can also see the areas in which the person has published. We do these word clouds two different ways, one by the number of papers in that subject area, and one by the number of citations in that area. And then something that I find useful in various pieces of my life over the years is finding the number of collaborators, again in a word cloud. If someone has a lot of collaborators, then you should come over here to co-authors, and it gives you a list of them in a different format. And here, when you find the list and you click on, say, a name, Werner Baumann, you will just go to Bauman's author profile. Whereas over here, if I click on it, I will find only the papers, in this case, one paper, that were co-authored by Baumann and Gromov. I'll get back to some other author searches in a second. The third sort of search is a journal search. And here again, you're looking right into our database of journals. And we've been collecting data on journals since 1940 through arrangements with publishers. We actually have information on journals going back to about 1830. And so we're giving you lots of help here. So for instance, I want to do an example where it's Proceedings of the London Math Society. I just start typing proceedings, and it starts filling in things with some journals that have a big presence in our journal database. Here, a lot of the presence is measured by number of articles in the database. So I click on Proceedings of the London Math Society. All of a sudden, I find out that there's more than one. And what's happened is that we've given a suggestion for the search, but not necessarily for the journal. And we've done the search that satisfies this criterion, that Proceedings of London Math Society is inside the title, not necessarily in that order, which is why you get some of these things, the Royal Society of London Proceedings. And then you just have to find the one that's that is active, and that's this, Proceedings of the London Math Society, third series. Now you can really see how rich our database is in terms of information about journals. In this screen, we give you some roughly bibliographic information about the journal. The publisher is the London Math Society, with Wiley on the scene as well. Here are two websites for the journal. If you're a librarian, you care about ISSNs. Here's the frequency that it's published. If you want to just go right to all the papers published by this journal, you click that, and there are all 6,000 of them. It's a little bit interesting here. If you resort by oldest first, we actually have information from the journal going back to the first volume in 1865, when De Morgan, who was president of the London Math Society at the time, started the journal. Again, if you're interested, we describe some of the history of the journal. You can see the various different publishers that helped them publish it. Hodgson, they did it for themselves for a little while. Cambridge University Press worked with them for a while. Wiley worked with them for a while. And then here's some data. Here are some data that are specific to us doing things. We compute this thing called the MCQ, the Mathematics Citation Quotient. And that's defined here. It's similar in spirit to an impact factor. We look back 5 years to see what the citations have been, and then we normalize by the number of papers that have been published in the journal. We make that available to you first as a graph, and then as a table, and so you can actually see for the year 2019, we give you both the numerator and the denominator. The numerator here is 568 citations in that 5-year window, and there were 387 publications in the journal during that window. Do that in your head, you get 1.47. Yeah, there's a question in here. How do you deal with junk academic journals that will publish anything? And Mike is answering that. We are selective in what journals we cover. That's a key thing. I mentioned at the beginning that Mathematical Reviews and MathSciNet are a division of the American Mathematical Society. We get instruction from the leadership, the governance of the AMS. You know, the most direct one for us is the Mathematical Reviews Editorial Oversight Committee, MREC. And the point is that they want us to be, as Mike says, selective. They don't want us to be some huge shopback that picks up everything imaginable that you might find that looks marginally mathematical, and which may be selective or may be, as Doug Lynn says, junk. And that means that we have the involvement of a lot of people to do this. We have 18 PhD mathematicians working for us in Ann Arbor at Mathematical Reviews. We have 22,000 reviewers who give us feedback either through their reviews or through comments as they're reviewing, saying, you know, this journal has really gone downhill. Please don't send me any more papers from this journal to review. And that all of that feeds into the way we make editorial decisions about what to cover and what not to cover. I mentioned the MCQ, the math citation quotient. There's another aspect where we try to emphasize, you know, the real core research literature. We currently cover roughly 1,800 journals in MathSciNet, and we take reference lists from about 1/3 of those. There are some journals where you know, it's mathematical research, but you know, it's on the margins as to whether or not it's mathematics versus engineering, or it's on the margins of whether it's, you know, really research or it's just a kind of obvious next perturbative step in some sort of problem. And so there's a long process. It usually, you know, takes, it's only once a year that we make decisions on what journals to add to reference lists. So that's a way that, first of all, we try to ensure that we're covering high quality journals. There's something to be said about a journal that, first of all, is covered by MathSciNet, and second of all, that's what we call a reference list journal. If you want to find out everything, if you want to be able to find out, you know, what courses have put this paper into the syllabus for, you know, a graduate level course or for seminar, Google Scholar includes all those sorts of things, and you can find them. But the AMS does not want to try and just replicate the behavior, the goals of other services. That's redundant. It doesn't make sense. So what we try to do is bring the bearing of being a professional mathematical society to the decisions about what's covered and how it's covered. I hope that answers your question, Doug. If not, put another one in there and we'll see what we can do. Yeah, anyway, some more information on journals on our pages. You can see the number of citations to the journal. Obviously, with something like Proceedings of the LMS, as you go back, There's some fundamental papers in there that just keep getting cited. And the papers that were published from 2015 to 2020, those numbers will go up as time passes. You can see the number of papers that are published per year. And then down here, something that I find particularly interesting for MathSciNet is you can see the topics of the papers that have been published either in the last 3 years or over all time. So you can see that there's a domination, that the top things are algebraic geometry, number theory, and group theory. If you look over all time, you're going to see a quirk of what goes on here. The top thing is other. The reason the top thing is other is because we receive so much data from the London Math Society about journals from before Math Reviews existed, that those items all go in with a sort of empty classification for subject, which we call other. And so all of their items from 1865 to 1939 are classified as other. So it's a little bit annoying, but given that we have tens of thousands of items from before 1940, not just for the proceedings of LMS, but for things like Krella's journal and others, it's impractical to go back and try and search those. But ignoring other, you can see it's that certain subjects have persisted. Group theory and number theory are still in the top. Algebraic geometry has dropped down to 4, ignoring the other category. And this can give you some sense of the profile of a journal. This can be important if you're thinking about sending a paper to a journal. You can also see who the top authors are, again, in the last 3 years. There's some familiar names on this list, or over all time, and there's some even more familiar names. The top 3, I think, are some of the, well, I mean, all of them pretty much on that page are, extremely well-known people. I think it's great that Cheryl Prager gets up there. I think she's, one of the few people that's still very active on this list. On Harold Davenport, unfortunately, died recently. So those are the 3 sorts of searches that are possible. Anyone have any questions about that little bit? All right. So let me go on. Another thing that you can do here as a mid-career mathematician, but also as an earlier or late career mathematician, is you can use our database to help you with your own bibliography. And so I switch the order that I'm going to talk about some things. So there's no good explanation off the bat as to why I'm picking Christian Rosedal here, other than the fact that he's giving an invited talk shortly after this thing ends. He's giving one of the Association of Symbolic Logic talks. And his talk is on groups with bounded geometry. So if Rosendahl is preparing his talk or preparing the write-up of his talk, he may want to take some shortcuts for fleshing out, this gives me a chance to point something out. He might want to flesh out his talk with some things about the subject and take a shortcut for putting them into a good format. So if you noticed, when I did this, I did the search and I got 0 matches. Well, the thing is, I made a mistake that I know better than, I know better than making that, is I put in the name Christian Rosendahl. If I'm doing precisely an author search, right, under that other tab that I mentioned before, I can put the author names in any order I want. The publication search is very fussy, and we do that intentionally. Well, mathematicians can be fussy and can be precise, and we also find that most of the time, but not all of the time, and not 98% of the time, but most of the time, when you're doing a publication search, you have a pretty good idea of what you want, and you want to be able to control it. So we intentionally make these searches fussy. And that means that author names have to go last name followed by first name. So let's just put in some random characters there, and I've messed it up again. All right, this is not going well. Let's try it over here. This went better last night. All right, so now we're on Rosenthal's page. Oh, that's why. Last night I didn't put in his name. So suppose I want to add some things to the write-up of my talk about groups with bounded geometry. I can just put in a search word to see what papers I've written on this. And now what I want to do is show you how to hurry up and get the BibTeX version of these things. So one way I can do this is I have this list of about 6 things. But let's just say that only half of them are useful. So I click this little box to the left. And now instead of saying that I want the reviews for a batch download, I say I want citations BibTeX. Right? And so I've now made that determination. And then if I click retrieve marked, it's going to give me the BibTeX form of the 3 I've checked. And so now I just highlight these things and I can copy and paste them into my BibTeX file. Oops. Another thing that I can do, I forgot to do something here. Another thing that I could do is I could take these things and underneath I can click this thing that says clipboard. And what that will do is quietly add things to a page called the clipboard that I can go back to. And so I can click more or less the same thing that I did before, but I can also initiate some other search. Now, instead of looking at my papers, I can look at any paper in the Math Reviews database that contains the words groups bounded geometry and start adding these guys to the clipboard too. Now I go back to the clipboard by coming up to the top of the page, hitting clipboard. Now I see that you know, the Rosendahl papers are there, as are the papers that I just added. You know, somewhat randomly. You know, presumably if you're doing this for one of your own papers, you'd be doing it more intelligently than I'm doing it here. And again, you get to select the format for a batch download here. So again, I want to do a batch download of BibTeX. And here, the notion is that I want to save the clip instead of, you know, on the other page, it was a slightly different wording. If I do save clip, all of a sudden, all of those items that I put on the clipboard are available to me in BibTeX. And I highlight, copy and paste into my BibTeX file, and away I go. What's handy here is that we have a bunch of insanely detail-oriented people verifying the bibliographic data here. You know, so if you are concerned about getting the pagination correct or the year of a paper correct, we've had people verify this. Second of all, we published it. So if we've gotten something wrong, we typically hear from somebody and we can correct it. There was a question in David in the chat. Can you specify phrases? Why, yes, you can. So suppose I want both the word, I want the word groups. I want to make sure it's in the review text, and I want the phrase bounded geometry. I put it in double quotes, and that will only look for the phrase bounded geometry anywhere. So it could be the title or the review text or the author's name, and then just the word groups can occur anywhere. But wait, there's more. The software behind this is something called Elasticsearch. And in one of the documents that Mike sent a link at the beginning of the chat, it explains that you can be a little bit more wiggly here. If you put your phrase in double quotes, take a tilde and add a single digit from 1 to 9, you can say how much space, how many words can be in between bounded and geometry, right? If you want bounded finite geometry, bounded whatever geometry, you can put in 1 or 2. I mean, putting in a number like 8 or 9 is a little bit silly, but putting in 1 or 2 is usually a reasonable thing to do. And so that allows you to do not just phrases, but phrases where you might have 1 or 2 words in there. Again, the point is that with these publication searches, we want you to be able to have a certain amount of control over the searches. We are mathematicians. We know how mathematicians frequently think and behave, and we think this matches up pretty well with that. Again, picking on poor Rosendahl. If you're applying for a job, right, and you want to update your CV, you can really hurry up putting in your publication list together. Here, you can download 50 items at a time in BibTeX form and paste those in, and make sure that you haven't missed anything in your own CV. So that can be handy. Any questions on that? Right. Here's something that is probably not useful to an early career mathematician. Is, what can I do if I'm an editor for a journal, and let's say it's a small journal and I don't have a lot of editors, and whatever comes in over the transom, I've got to deal with it. So just for fun, or maybe because I'm borderline idiot, I went to the archive yesterday and just randomly picked something from the archive's new papers in mathematics, pretending that someone had sent this to me to submit to a non-existent journal that I have. And so it was a paper called Non-Local Logistic Equations with Neumann Conditions. Definitely outside my comfort zone. My specialization was in semi-simple Lie groups, representation theory, and algebraic geometry. Non-local logistic equations, pretty much a zero intersection with my world. And so how could I, how could I find something like that? Maybe I should put up what that was on the archive. All right, so that was the paper. It was submitted on January 7th. And so if either Di Piero, Proietti, or Valdenocci is here, or one of their colleagues or friends, I apologize for picking on you. But you were on the first page of hits yesterday on the archive. So how could I, as an editor for a small journal, working outside my comfort zone, deal with this? You can modify what I say when you're closer to your comfort zone on a journal. But here I just wanted to give something that was in some sense an extreme example that might work for people. One thing that I can do is I can look for other papers by these people. Right, I'm an editor. I've got to figure out what am I going to do with this paper now that's been submitted by my journal. Should I do a sort of a desk review of it? Can I find somebody else there? One question that occurs to people typically is this someone writing a paper that's in their wheelhouse? Is this something they write a lot about, or is this something where they're off on the side? Should I be looking askance at this? And if I look at this, I'm going to pick on the first author here. So sorry, Serena Di Piero. And I can see that, she's published most of her papers in PDEs. Oops. And in fact, I can see that, she has 70 papers and 43 of them are in PDEs. So that seems like a reasonable thing for her to be working on. One thing that I can do also is I can look at these papers. I can go over here on the left-hand side of the page, the sidebar, these things, we call them facets. I can pick just the ones that are on PDE. By clicking that, it now restricts to the papers that were published with the math subject classification 35 for PDEs. And I can start going down these, and if I really want to take a shortcut, I can just look at the names of the people that were reviewers of her papers for MathSciNet and think, why not get Bhattacharya to review this paper? Well, I might want to look at the paper and see if there's sufficient overlap. PDE is a very broad field. But this provides you with, certainly a real shortcut for trying to find potential reviewers for a paper. If you encounter reviewers who are big names in their own right, Ambrosio, say, who's, you might decide that this is someone that you want to try and get an opinion from. Or if you know one of these people, you can have a better shot of them saying yes to agreeing to reviewing this paper. So this is one way of taking the person's existing work and seeing who else has provided a review in the sense of MathSciNet review. Another thing you can do is you can look at reference lists and here, I could look at this person's papers. I can sort by citations and just find the paper that has the most citations. Now look at the people, the biggest chunk of people that have cited work by this person. Over here under authors, I can see that Shanhua Tang has cited this particular paper by Di Piero, 13 times. I might want to look up Tang a little bit further and think of this person as a potential reviewer. Another thing, which I think might be fairly obvious, but I'll say it anyway, is we have this paper over here on the archive, that's now in my pretend journal, on non-local logistic equations with Neumann conditions. I can just search on that in the MR database. So being not a complete ignoramus about mathematics, I know that two of the keywords here are logistic and Neumann. So I put those in an anywhere search. Unfortunately, I've worked at Math Reviews long enough that I've memorized all of the math subject classification code. So I know that 35 equals PDE. And so I could do a search on all papers that contain logistic normons somewhere in the MathSciNet listing for them that are in PDE. And that would be okay, but I might be wasting my time, because I get 94 papers. So a good way, since I'm thinking of being, since I'm pretending I'm an editor right now, I really want to look at the more current things. So I come down here, instead of searching the whole database, let's just put in a year range. Let's look at the past 10 years, right? So it's a strictly greater than, so it's going to be everything greater than 2010. So 2011 through 2020, with a little bit in 2021 perhaps, right? Well, now there's still 76 papers, but at least as I go poking through this list to try and find some potential reviewers, I'm throwing out the papers that are possibly not up to date. And so, one of the things that I can do here is, well, I could look paper by paper and see, there are, matches between them. But again, I'm a poor, overworked editor of a small journal sitting in Michigan. I want some shortcuts. So one shortcut is to look at the authors and see who are the authors that met my criteria most often. And over here in this facet for authors, the criteria specified, I see that Chunlai Mu, Wangchan Wang, Michael Winkler, Sining Zhang, these are the people that have most frequently met the criteria that I put as sort of quickly encapsulating this paper. And so what I would do, again, being out of my depth as an editor with a paper outside my specialization, is I would start looking at the publications of these people in that area, trying to get a sense of whether or not this is going to be helpful for me. All right. There are plenty of other ways that you can use the database. The main thing for me is to mention the idea that you can use MathSciNet to help you as an editor. A lot of times you're not just an editor of a small journal, based in the public park of Ann Arbor, Michigan. You're a topical editor, right? The editors for the journals of the AMS, transactions, proceedings, etc. You're all specified. You would be a geometry editor, you'd be a topology editor, you'd be a logic and foundations editor. And so a lot of times the papers would come in, you'd already have a sense of who suitable people are. But even still, sometimes you'll be pressed. It'll be at the boundary of what you know. If it's in logic and you're a set theorist and something comes along and it's more complexity theory, you may want to do a little bit of searching. But again, you'd know the area moderately well. Your searches would be a bit more focused. And you'd be able to apply both information in our database plus your intelligence about the subject itself. Another thing that you can use this for is when you're hiring, right? You might want to do some, finding out about the candidates that have come in. Again, this is kind of obvious. If someone's applying to your department, they're going to provide you with a package. It's probably going to come through Math Jobs. It's going to be information in there, including their publication list. But if you want to, explore the publication list a little bit more thoroughly, you can come here and look at their actual publications, right? Here, some of these papers are too new, so they're not going to have a review. But you can actually open up, one of the papers, and in this case, it's a brief review, get a little sense of what's in there without actually having to read the paper. You can also get a sense of some of these people, where do they fit into the world of mathematics? Do they have a lot of collaborators? You can see that right here. With Rosendahl, you can see, that he has, about 20 collaborators. Is that the type of person that you want for your department, or do you not care whether or not this is someone who's collaborating a lot? You might care more that this is a person who is going to be able to teach a lot or is going to be able to develop some program for you. But the wealth of data that we have in our database can help answer what are common questions that come up where you want to answer them in as many different sources as possible. This is a source based on published literature that you can help. You can also, I did that quickly. You can also come down here to the Math Genealogy project, click on that, find the person in the Math Genealogy project, and you can find out, has this person supervised any PhD theses, right? This would be if you're hiring someone at, tenure track or tenure level. Typically, this is not a consideration if you're hiring someone to a postdoc position. Again, it's useful information. It may be on their the CV that they turn in for their application packet. One of the things that you can further do, though, is you can look at the people that the person has supervised and find them in MathSciNet to see how have these people done post being a PhD student of this possible job candidate. I'm running out of time here a little bit. One other thing that I'd like to mention, though, is that another thing that you might do as a mid-career mathematician is you might be asked to write a letter of recommendation for someone. Again, there are a lot of things that you normally do. If you're writing a letter of recommendation for someone, you ought to know that person somewhat, right? But again, if you want to fill in the details, if you want to take some shortcuts, if you were asked to write a letter of recommendation for Rosendahl, and you want to actually mention something specific about some of the papers that he's published, you can come here and either refine the search to get right to the paper you want, or you can search for just the publications, maybe look at the most highly cited ones and say that you want to comment in your letter about their 3 most highly cited papers. You can go through this, you can find what they are. If you're doing this through your library, if you click on the article link, you'll actually go right to the paper. And so you could find it there and actually read it if you wanted to. Again, what I want to do is just mention the idea of using MathSciNet in the context of being an editor for a journal, being on a hiring committee, or being the recommender, writing letters for some people. It's a way of putting rather authoritative data in your hands for this process. So let me stop and address any questions that people might have. And feel free to use the chat, or since I'm going to be a little bit quieter, you can actually just unmute yourself and ask them if you want. Oh, here's a question. Not all published papers in MathSciNet have been reviewed. What is the criteria to be reviewed? Thanks. Well, kind of the leading term on that is, do we have a reviewer? We add, in a typical year, we add about 125,000 items to Math Reviews or to MathSciNet per year. We have about 23,000 reviewers. On average, reviewers will review almost 3 papers a year. I forget what the exact number is. It's like 2.7. So the math doesn't quite work out. And so some of it is luck of the draw. If you have a paper that's in an area that has a lot of reviewers, the odds are a little bit better that your paper will be reviewed. And then the decision is how central, how new are the results in this, and is this paper fairly similar to other papers in the area, in which case, we could get away with just using the summary, or is there something subtle in this where it would be nice to have, a third party, a reviewer um, saying something. But that's one of the hardest decisions that we have to make on a daily basis is, one of our editors is sitting there looking at, say 10 or 20 papers and have not enough reviewers for all of them. How do you decide which one goes where? And a lot of it is just, which one will really benefit, our users more by having a review, whereas which one, it's going to be fairly clear what's in there. People are asking about thoughts on the reviewing process or advice for new reviewers. Mike is going to post a link to our guide for reviewers in the chat. Yeah, the first thing to remember is that reviews are more like book reviews as opposed to referee reports. New reviewers have a tendency to slip into writing in the style of a referee report. And that's not what we need. We're not trying to make a decision, should we accept or reject this paper, or should this paper have some modifications before we accept it. And so think of it in terms of a book review. And in the best case, you'll answer 3 questions. What's the context of this paper, right? Where does it come from? Is it just coming out of the clear blue sky, or are there other things around it going on? And typically you can address the context in just 2 or 3 sentences, because again, you can assume that you're writing for other research mathematicians. Secondly, what's in the paper? What has the author or what have the authors done in the paper that's new? And so you can state what the main result is, or if there are more than one. You can also state, what are the techniques? That's very useful. And you don't have to get into the weeds on this. You can say that they prove such and such a theorem by a spectral analysis of the operators involved in the system, right, as opposed to some other sort of analysis. Or you can, if it's something in representation theory where I know what's going on, you can say, they're using techniques of algebraic geometry and specify what they are. You're using something very much like Schmidt's thesis as opposed to Zuckerman modules. Or you can state, some other paper that's in, the MathSciNet and say, they're building on the results there. The third question, which you can't always answer, but when you can, it's great, is are there things that this will lead to, other things? This paper opens up an area of research because they, it may just be a lemma, but it's a lemma that we need to start proving these other theorems. So if you can do those 3 things, you've gone a long way to writing a useful review for someone else. Does that answer your question? All right, great. Yeah, I mean, the reviews, a lot of times the point of the review is helping someone decide whether or not they want to read the paper. You can read a review in somewhere between 3 and 15 minutes, depending on how technical the paper and the review are. But to really read a math paper, digest it and understand it is going to take you days or weeks, possibly months. And so if you've written a good review, you've really helped someone make the decision, do I really want to spend days reading this paper or not? Yeah, if you're on the MathSciNet website, oddly enough, we should name this, but there's some nice resources on the page that we call the librarian page. So You can get a link to the blog that I write about MathSciNet. You can get a link to some explanations about what we're doing, what we do and how we do it in this searching MathSciNet section. You can also get some information about the database itself, MathSciNet by the numbers. You can see that we currently have 24,000 active reviewers. You can see how many items are in the database. But poke around, play with things. If you have questions, contact me. A Google search for Edward Dunne AMS will help you find me, and I will try and answer your questions. I hope that this was useful to you. If you are a mid-career mathematician, I hope you use our database in your professional life. I also hope that you consider becoming a reviewer. That little back of the envelope calculation, 125,000 papers, 25,000 reviewers at a rate of 2.7 means that the more experienced mathematicians we have becoming reviewers, the more likely we're going to be able to get all the good papers reviewed that we'd like to. All right. Well, the great convex supervisor in the sky is going to shut our door in the next 3 minutes. Feel free to post a quick question. Mike has put his email address in the chat. Here's mine. If you're quick enough, you can get it, but I'm easily Googled. And at this point, let me thank you all for coming. It's nice to have you. It's even nicer when I can see you in person. And so I hope for the next JMM that I'll be able to meet some of you in person and talk to you a bit more. Oh, Mike has put the link to a survey. Please go to the survey, answer some questions. It's very, very short. It's 4 questions. I did it as a sample and it took like 2 minutes. And it took me maybe 2.5 minutes because I thought about the wording of one of the questions. Could we say this better? So please go and do that. Doug Lind is pointing out that next year JMM is in Seattle. Yes, that'll be a great place to visit. I hope to see not just Doug Lind, but everybody else in Seattle. And I think it's time to go. So once again, thank you for sitting through this. Thank you for the questions that you asked. The survey for students only. It's definitely geared for students. If you think it's misleading for you to answer it, then feel free to skip it. No obligation. Anyway, thank you again, and I hope to see you in Seattle.